Mafia were a group of people who I really think, one of the reasons that I find them so fascinating is they are technologists, they are innovators, but their primary driver is moral. They really, really, really wanted to find a way to fight a war without destroying half of Europe and without obliterating an entire generation.
Welcome to Washington Post Live. I'm David Ignatius, a columnist for the Post. Today, it's a special pleasure to welcome back to the Washington Post Malcolm Gladwell. It's not a big part of Malcolm's biography, but back in the 1980s, I tried to hire Malcolm as a writer for the Outlook section of the Post that I was editing. He went to the Post's business section instead, was a star there, left us, went on to the New Yorker and a series of bestsellers that's extraordinary. Malcolm, welcome back.
Thank you, David. It's a real pleasure.
So let's talk about your new book, The Bomber Mafia, A Dream, a Temptation, and the Longest Night of the Second World War. As a starter, break down that title for us. What was the Bomber Mafia? What was the dream? What was the temptation? And what was that longest night?
The Bomber Mafia were a group of pilots in Montgomery, Alabama, Maxwell Airfield, who had a dream of reinventing warfare. We thought that they could take the new kinds of bombers that were being built in the late 1930s and combine them with technology that allowed them to drop bombs with precision, and they could render every other part of the modern military obsolete. And so that was the dream in the subtitle. The temptation was when that dream proved more difficult to realize than they had imagined, they were tempted. They were tempted by an alternate way of bombing the enemy. And the longest night of the Second World War, one of the longest nights of the Second War, I mean, I imagine there were many long nights, but I was interested in one in particular, which was the firebombing of Tokyo on March 9th, 1945, which was the kind of end result of the conflict between this dream and this temptation.
We'll get back to the horrifying details of the Tokyo firebombing in a bit. But I want to ask you, Malcolm, to share with our viewers what you say at the beginning of the book about how writing this was kind of a personal obsession. And you go into detail about your life as a child, about the life of your father. Tell us about that.
Yeah, my father, who was English, grew up in Kent during the war. He was a small child during the war. And Kent was what they called Bomb Alley. It was the German planes that were bombers that were flying to bomb London during the Blitz flew over Kent. And my father, as a little boy, was instructed by my grandmother to sleep under his bed as a kind of, that was the best they could come up with to protect him against the chance of a bomb dropping in their house. In fact, a bomb did drop in the backyard of my grandparents' house, which was just about the most exciting thing that ever happened to my father. So I grew up hearing these stories about the sensation, what it meant like as a child for my dad to be in harm's way, in the middle of he wasn't caught up in the Blitz in London, which was a very more serious matter, but he was 30 miles away from London and heard planes every night. And I just thought, as a kid, I just thought that was an unbelievably exciting and exotic thing to have happened in your childhood. I was growing up in maybe the most boring place on earth, rural southern Ontario in the 70s. And here I had a father who, had German bombers flying overhead and dropping bombs in his backyard. So I think that's where the seed was sown.
Well, that's certainly an illustration of the imprecision of bombing. I don't know what the Germans were trying to hit when they dropped that in your backyard. Our former colleague at the Post, Tom Ricks, writing about your book in the New York Times, called it a kind of love song to the U.S. Air Force, which is surprising, Tom wrote, because it's the least romantic of our armed services, with leaders who focus on technology, not tradition. I found that over the years in covering the military, the Air Force hungers for the kind of attention that ground forces got, especially during these past years of Iraq and Afghanistan. Give us a sense of what you found about the Air Force culture. You talk about having met with the chief of staff of the Air Force at the time. Give us a sense of what today's Air Force is like.
Well, I will say to stay on the personal, they're my people. So when I say that, my father was an engineer. He taught in the engineering department he was a mathematician by training, but he was a civil engineer. He, in fact, a big chunk of the work he did in his academic life was to design the surfaces of airplane fuselages so they could deal with the stresses of going through different temperatures and different air pressures. And the Air Force is, of course, full of people like that. It's the engineers service. And there's a lovely thing that I talk about in the book, which I ran across years ago. There was a military analyst at RAND who wrote a book about the three services and their differences. And he has that wonderful passage where he compares the three chapels of the three services at service academies. And of course, the Army Chapel at West Point is this kind of Gothic, gray granite, hulking, small windows. It looks like it's been there for 500 years, overlooking the Hudson. The Navy is this kind of magnificent Italianate, burnished brass and marble, and it's everything the Navy is. He's kind of, and the chapel at the Air Force Academy is the most extraordinary thing you've ever seen. It's actually one of the quintessential examples of modern architecture in the United States. It looks like it's from the 22nd century, whereas the armies look like it's from the 19th century. And the minute I've never been to the Air Force Academy, when I read that passage from that book, I looked up a picture on my phone of the Air Force Academy, and I was like, oh, that's the one I want to belong to. That's where my heart lies. I don't want to, if I had to worship in one of these three chapels, I don't want the Italianate, Beaux-Arts thing in the middle of Annapolis, and I certainly don't want the gray, brooding monolith in West Point. I want the Air Force one. That's cool. So my heart is with the Air. I mean, when I read that comment by Tom Rex, I was like, he's absolutely right. I mean, I fell in love with the Air Force when I was doing this book.
So you talked, Malcolm, to a lot of Air Force officers, senior leadership in Washington, and pilots at the Air House, as it's called. So I have a weird question, but it's of the moment. Did any of the pilots talk to you about UFOs, or did you ask them? This is something we're all now suddenly extremely interested in, and I'm curious whether you have any special information for us.
I was so consumed with talking about the Second World War that I didn't get it. I was so consumed with the past, I didn't get to the future. If I was doing it today, I mean, you're kidding me. I would absolutely ask about that, but I didn't know.
And so I have to ask, what is the Malcolm Gladwell take on UFOs, or UAPs, as the new jargon has it? What do you think?
Well, you're talking to someone who believes in ghosts. So to establish a kind of baseline here, I have no difficulty whatsoever with things that are outside of our imagination. So I see no reason. I mean, why wouldn't there be UFOs? I've never been under the illusion that we were alone in the world.
Well, I hope there's a future Malcolm Gladwell book in this, or in the way we think about them. So you structure the Bomber Mafia around two personalities, and the decision to relieve the first, Brigadier General Haywood Hansel, and replace him with a second, Major General Curtis LeMay. But it's really about the two approaches to bombing, aerial bombing that they represented. Hansel was the precision bombing guy. Let's take out the strategic targets. And LeMay was the guy who said, get the job done, and ended up being an area bombing or morale bombing advocate. LeMay often in the history books comes down as kind of a nasty guy. His Cold War role in the 50s is part of that. He comes across in your book as a much more sympathetic character, interesting, I mean, straightforward, plain spoken, but an interesting guy. To just tell us a little bit about LeMay and about that debate, and describe the two personalities better than I could.
So Haywood Hansel is one of the leaders of the Bomber Mafia. So he's part of this group of idealists down in Alabama who have this dream of reinventing war, of bombing with such precision that the wholesale killing of civilians in aerial warfare would no longer be necessary. So he's a kind of, and he's exactly what you would imagine for that role. He is this kind of romantic figure whose favorite book is Don Quixote, who comes from a long line of, he's comes from an old Southern military family with, a grandfather who fought in the Confederate general, and a great-grandfather or great-great-grandfather who fought in the Revolutionary War. I mean, he's that kind of, he wrote poetry, he sang show tunes to his men as he brought them back from bombing missions. He was a daredevil pilot in the 30s. He's a kind of this sort of handsome, charming, dashing character that we associate with the romance of aviation in those years. LeMay is the opposite. LeMay is a kid from the wrong side of the tracks in Columbus, who is about as ruthless and unsentimental and uninterested in big ideas as you can get. He was a tactician, not a strategist. In fact, he's responsible for some of the most extraordinary tactical innovations in air warfare in the Second World War. There are those who will say he's the greatest combat commander of the Second World War. I mean, people who say that are Air Force people who are inclined to pick one of their own for that. But he's really he is a warrior in the kind of classic sense of the word, who believes that the only responsibility of a military leader is to fight war with such brutality that the war will be over as soon as possible. He felt that was your job. Go in there and do absolutely everything you can. Observe no nicety in order to get the thing over as quickly as possible. So he and Hansel couldn't be more different. They are at opposite ends of this continuum. They don't particularly like each other, but more than that, they just represent totally different ideas about what the role of a general is in wartime. And Hansel's trying to reform war, and LeMay's trying to make it more brutal so that he can get it over with. And I feel it's a very it's a stark version of a conflict that goes on in any domain, right? Between the idealist and the realist, the romantic and the unsentimental one, the ruthless and the cautious, the moral and the amoral. I mean, I could go on. It's like this is why this story was such sort of catnip for me, because it was like, here you have it. I mean, you have in these two characters everything that war represents, right? And the idea that I will confess, as much as I am sympathetic to LeMay, my heart is with Hansel, and the failure of his dream is heartrending. I mean, if he had pulled off what he wanted to pull off, quite literally hundreds of thousands of people would have been their lives would have been saved. And LeMay, I accept LeMay's decisions as necessary, but that doesn't mean I'm comfortable with them.
I have a marvelous scene in the book in which you describe photos that LeMay had at his residence from Germany, and then you say the photo you wish he had. Tell our viewers a little bit about each.
Yeah, so LeMay became disillusioned with the Bomber Mafia very early on in the Second World War. It was when both Hansel and LeMay were stationed in Europe, and Hansel had conceived of what he thought would be a death blow against the German war machine, which was an attack on a series of ball bearing factories in a little town called Schweinfurt in Bavaria. And according to Hansel's theory of strategic bombing, that if you could take out the ball bearing factories, and that was the principal source of ball bearings for the German army, you would make it, excuse me, you would make it all but impossible for the Germans to wage war, because ball bearings go into everything every bit of machinery you make for an army or an air force uses ball bearings, right? Everything that has a moving part has a ball bearing in it. And Hansel said, let's destroy their ability to make ball bearings and they'll be helpless. And so he said, he planned this elaborate raid on Schweinfurt, where all the ball bearing factories were. And it was a disaster. And who was one of the key members in leading that raid was Curtis LeMay. And he witnesses the disaster of LeMay's strategy firsthand. And I think it cements his conviction that what Hansel was doing and the Bomber Mafia were doing were pursuing a hopelessly naive notion about how to wage war. And LeMay lost many men in that attack on Schweinfurt. And he had I described the story of somebody long after LeMay had retired. A junior officer was going to his house to deliver a package, and the doors opened, and he sees in the foyer to LeMay's house a large blown-up picture of the factories they bombed at Schweinfurt, what they used to call strike photos. He wanted to have a living reminder every time he entered his house of what he considered to be the most disastrous raid that he had participated in as an Air Force officer. And I thought that spoke volumes about the man, right? This is the 1970s. I mean, the war's been over for 30 years. This is a man who went on to have one of the most extraordinary careers in the US Air Force of anyone of his generation. And yet, what does he choose to put in a position of honor in his house is a picture of his greatest failure. Not just his greatest failure, a picture of his adversary's greatest failure, right? It's a man who carried a grudge. These characters are just they're fantastic.
And Malcolm, what's the photograph that you wish he had on his wall?
Well, he would then go on and refute the logic of the Bomber Mafia and say what we really need to be doing to our enemies is simply bombing everything we can. Instead of pursuing a policy of precision bombing, let's just, in the case of the cities of Japan, he was like, let's just burn the cities down with napalm. And he launches the first of those strikes, what would be 66 strikes over the summer of 1945 against Tokyo on March 9th, 1945, and burns alive about 40 or 50,000 people, and burns down about 16 square miles of Tokyo. And it is an attack. It is one of the most horrific attacks of the war. And I wish he had a strike photo of that attack in his foyer as well. I mean, I think he should not just remember his adversary's lowest moment. He should also remember a time when he did something, maybe, like I said, may well have been militarily necessary, but that doesn't make it any less unspeakable. I wish that he had chosen to memorialize that moment as well.
Do you think, Malcolm, given your conversations with Air Force Chief of Staff Goldfein, your research, uh, that we now have entered the world that General Hansel envisioned? We do now have precision bombing thanks to JDAMs, guided missiles that can, do the impossible, can get into that pickle barrel. In
Yeah.
the analogy that you described. So do you think that the advent of actual precision bombing opens the way for a kind of warfare in which civilians are less likely to be held at ransom?
I mean, potentially, although the first thing that General Goldfein would tell you is that um, precision bombing, um, as good as precision bombing is now, also makes it a lot easier to go to war, right? So, we see this all the time now. Now that you can hit anyone you want, wherever they are, so long as you know their coordinates and not take out and keep collateral damage to a minimum, what's stopping you from going to war every day? And there are plenty of people who have argued that what the future holds is a kind of continuous level of precise but low level conflict, because there are no, what's holding you back? Why wouldn't you take out if you knew where all of the the senior leadership of Al Qaeda or Hamas or anyone were at any given moment, why wouldn't you just take them out, right? That's the kind of decision making that possibility that faces military commanders today. So it's a trade-off. I mean, will we kill 50,000 people in one night any longer because we burned down an entire city? No, but you hesitate to kind of I hesitate to go long on the morality of war making. People come up with new ways to commit unspeakable acts. So, and certainly some of the other weapons in the offing, biological weapons, for example, have none of that precision capability. So maybe what we've done is we've simply replaced one method of mass destruction with another.
This is a period when we're talking and thinking a lot about racial justice, and recently we've been focused on intolerance and acts of violence against Asian Americans. Our reviewer of your book in the Washington Post wondered why you didn't write about the kinds of racial insensitivity, just flat out racism that some of these commanders expressed against the Japanese. General Hansel said there was a universal feeling, in quotes, among U.S. forces that the Japanese were subhuman. General LeMay said similar things. There's not a discussion of that in the book. I'm curious about whether that was a conscious decision you made, and what in general you think in this period when we're talking and thinking about racism against Asian Americans is worth thinking about and recovering from the past.
Yeah, I mean, I definitely thought about it and decided for a number of reasons, and maybe not in the end good reasons, not to go into it. One was there's some really, really, really wonderful, powerful books written on this very subject. One in particular, which I read and thought, I can't, I can do a little mini version of this argument, but can't do justice to it in the kind of story I'm trying to tell. I have written enough about racism in some of my other books to know that it is such a kind of complicated issue that I thought that there was a risk if I dipped my toe in that water and did half a chapter on it, I would be somehow doing an injustice to the topic. That was one notion I had. The other thing was a more kind of, I was very conscious and you always get that, you must know this as well, when you're writing about an issue as complicated as Second World War in particular. There is really no end to the things that you can talk about. And so your primary job as a storyteller is about what you're leaving out, not what you're putting in. And I was very much trying to discipline myself. I wanted to write a very short, manageable, popular work of history. And more than that, because the audiobook is so it's where we began with this project, was making what we thought would be a really great audiobook using all of the old tape. And in that as well, I wanted something that was, of manageable size. And so there are lots and lots and lots of things I didn't put in that if I were doing a different kind of book, I probably would have. I don't feel as bad about that when in cases where there have been really wonderful histories written on that aspect of it. And people, I suppose the best I can do is to encourage people to read that. I've always thought of my books that their chief function is that they are introductions to a topic. That I'm happiest if once someone has read one of my books, they go on to read more deeply in the same area. That's my role, is to whet your appetite. I'm not where you become sated.
So let me just ask, in the couple of minutes we have remaining, ask you to talk a little bit about the Malcolm Gladwell method. You've had a string of extraordinary books, bestsellers, The Tipping Point, Outliers, you could go on and on. Tell us briefly how you decide on a subject. Your books typically have been about themes in social psychology that you find a way to express quickly, clearly, accessibly. How do you choose a topic? How do you research it? And then I got one more question for you before we go.
Okay. I don't really know. It's all very idiosyncratic. It seems to be whatever I'm interested in the moment. I'm a generalist. I'm an old newspaper reporter. So I very much have the ethic that if I apply myself and do some reporting, I should be able to write at least reasonably intelligently about a wide range of topics. Once you're free of the kind of burden of true expertise, you can write interesting things on a wide variety of topics. I am free of the burden of true expertise. But mostly I'm interested, I love the kind of complexities. I mentioned this book, for example, that I've always been drawn to obsessives. And that idea of the conflict between someone's deepest and most powerful motivations and the world around them is something that is of infinite interest to me. And in many of my books, I have kind of returned to that theme about what happens when your internal self has to deal with the external world. And why I'm so taken with that particular dilemma, I have no idea.
So, Malcolm, I'm going to close with a question from one of our audience members, Michael Dickens in Maryland, who asks, are there epiphanies that you've had in your writing life that shape you going forward? I'd love to know the answer to that myself.
Oh, I guess the biggest thing I've found in my writing life is that I have discovered, and not really my own, but I've firsthand the kind of human capacity for reinvention. I'm always struck as a writer how different my work is today than it was 10 years or 20 years or 30 years ago. How I'm interested in different things, how I approach things differently, how I write in a different fashion. I almost feel like I don't recognize my 25 or 30-year-old self, which is an incredibly fascinating and encouraging thought. And that's kind of spilled over in my life, and that I have it's changed the way I view others, I think. I no longer have this attitude that people are who they will always be, who they are in the moment. In the moment you encounter them, I now have a much healthier sense of the people's capacity to change.
Well,
but wait, David,
that's
go before I say, as the world should know, that I'm an enormous fan of your thrillers. I've read every single one of them, and I am waiting impatiently for the next one, with an emphasis on impatient. Where is it? Come on, your audience.
It's coming. You're very sweet to say that. The conversation is just fascinating. We could go on happily, I think, for another 30 or 50 minutes. But I want to thank Malcolm Gladwell for joining us, for talking about his new book, The Bomber Mafia, which is a marvelous read, an introduction to so many complex thoughts. Malcolm, thanks for joining us.
Good. Thank you, David.
So at 3 o'clock today, Washington Post Live will be talking to Minnesota Senator Amy Klobuchar, and at 5 o'clock to actress Mila Kunis, director Rodrigo Garcia, and our own Eli Saslow about an extraordinary new movie. Tomorrow, I will be back with Kristalina Georgieva, the managing director of the IMF. So I hope you'll join us tomorrow for that. Thanks for being with us on Washington Post Live.